Morning, students. So today we will start with valuation of shares. Now to begin with, we all know that there are two types of shares which can be issued by the company. The first one is the equity shares and the second one is the preference shares. Now the investors who have bought the equity shares are usually called as the owners of the company, whereas that is not the case in case of preference shares. Preference shares basically they pay you a regular fixed dividend. Okay, so even if the company is not in profits, it has suffered some huge loss, say, still the company is bound to pay a fixed dividend to the preference shareholders. If the profit of the company is high, the preference share dividend will be high. Such a thing does not happen. Even if the profits of the company is high, the preference dividend will remain fixed throughout the life of those preference shares. The dividend is neither lowered nor increased depending upon the profits of the company. Now, if a firm is facing, say, a financial difficulty, okay, some financial crunch, and for some reason the dividend is suspended, say the preference dividend is suspended for some period of time because the company is experiencing some crunch, okay, in that case the firm is required to pay arrears of preference dividend before paying the equity dividend. Now, equity shares, you know, the investors who invest in equity shares will get the dividend only and only if the company is making profits. If the company is not making profits, the equity shareholders won't get the dividend. Whereas in case of preference shares, the investors who have invested in the preference shares should get a fixed dividend throughout the life of those preference shares. Say due to some reason, okay, the company could not pay the dividend, the preference dividend could not pay paid by the company due to some financial crunch which the company is experiencing. In that case, when the company will incur profits, that time before paying the dividend to the equity shareholders, the company will have to pay arrears of dividend, preference dividend, to the preference shareholders. So even if the company is going under financial crunch currently, when the company will be in profits, it will have to pay the dividend whichever they had not paid earlier. Now they will have to pay in arrears to the preference shareholders before making any dividend payment to the equity shareholders. Okay, so now that is the basic difference between them. Now let us move on to the first one, that is preference shares. Now, preference shares, like bonds, there are two types, that is redeemable and irredeemable. Okay, that is the definition remains the same as we have seen in case of bonds. Redeemable preference shares, they can be redeemed after a certain period of time, whereas irredeemable preference shares, they do not have any maturity. They do not have any period of life. They cannot be redeemed at any time during their life. That is, it is an infinite period the preference shares have been issued. They can be redeemed only at the time of liquidation of the company. Okay, but in India we don't have irredeemable preference shares, we have only redeemable preference shares. Okay, now let us move ahead, that is value of preference shares. Let us try to understand what is the formula of value of preference shares. Now preference shares, they pay something called as fixed annual dividend during its lifeline. I told you all, irrespective, even if the company is making losses, even if the company is making very high profits, the dividend won't change. Whatever they had promised when issuing the preference shares, that amount of dividend only they will have to pay throughout the life of that preference shares. Like in case of equity, what happens if the company makes huge profits, then the dividend also which is given to the equity shareholders is high. But in case of preference shares, that is not the case. They get a fixed amount of profit irrespective, even if the company is making profits, even if the company is making losses, the preference shareholders are going to get a fixed dividend. So the preference shares basically pays a fixed annual dividend during its lifeline and the principal amount on maturity. And on maturity, they will pay some principal amount to this preference shareholders. So that is the reason why the formula is as follows. The same formula which we used for the bond, the same formula will be repeated over here, because the same thing, there is a dividend which is paid, plus there is redemption value at the end of maturity of the preference shares. Okay, At the end of life of the preference shares, or at maturity, you will get some redemption amount they have said, or some principal amount they have said. The same thing which we saw in case of bonds, but in case of bonds it was interest and redemption value on maturity. Over here it is preference dividend and redemption value on maturity. So we have value of preference shares, which is equal to preference dividend divided by 1 plus Kp the whole raised to t. What is this Kp? This is nothing but cost of preference shares. In case of bonds, it was R or it was Kd, if you remember. It was R or it was Kd, but over here it is Kp. Okay, the same thing, it is nothing but required rate of return or cost of preference shares. That is what Kp stands for. The whole raised to t, that is the term, plus this is nothing but maturity value or the principal amount which you will get on redemption, that is mn the whole divided by 1 plus kp the whole raised to n. Now you can see that the preference dividend as well as the principal amount both are divided by the discounting factor on by taking into consideration R. That is, R is nothing but required rate of return, which is nothing but KP, which is nothing but R. Okay, so taking KP into consideration, the discounting factor is used to discount the preference dividend and to discount the principal amount in order to find out the value of preference shares currently. That is, the current price or the current value of preference shares is found out by discounting the preference dividend and by discounting the maturity value. Okay, now let us simplify this formula with the help of present value interest factor annuity and the present value interest factor, the same thing that we did in case of bonds. Okay, taking this formula, now let us simplify it. So value of preference shares is equal to preference dividend multiplied by present value interest factor annuity at the rate of kp for n years, plus maturity value into present value interest factor at the rate of kp for n years. Now why we have used present value interest factor annuity for preference dividend like coupons which we saw in bonds? These dividends are also paid regularly, right? They are paid over a period of time. Throughout the life of those preference shares, this preference dividend is paid. So rather than calculating the value of preference dividend for each year independently, what you can do is directly multiply it with the present value interest factor annuity at the rate of kp for whatever the life of that preference shares is. Rather than finding individually for the first year how much is the value, for the second year how much is the value, we can do that. Whereas the redemption value, or you can say the maturity value, is paid only at the end, okay, of the life of preference share, and that is the reason why we are just using present value interest factor. Okay, because that only once you are getting, whereas preference dividend you are getting many times throughout the life of that preference share, and that is the reason why we are multiplying it with the present value interest factor annuity. Okay, so I hope the value of preference share, the formula is very clear. It is similar to bonds. Only in case of bonds we used to use coupons. Over here we are going to use preference dividend, and the maturity value, it is going to be the same case as it was in case of bonds. You are getting it only at the end of life of that investment. Like if you have invested in bond, at the end of that maturity of that bond, in case if you have invested in preference shares, at the end of life of that preference share you are going to get a principal amount or some maturity amount. Okay, whereas the preference dividend you are going to get throughout the life. That is, if the life of that preference share is say 5 years, then for all those 5 years you will get your preference dividend. Now it will depend whether it is semi annually, weekly, monthly. What you are getting the dividend on, that will depend on the terms on which the preference dividend was issued by the company. Okay, but the same formula with respect to bonds, whatever we have seen, the same thing is with respect to value of preference shares. Okay, now let us move on to the cost of preference shares. Okay, now in case of bonds we saw something called as YTM, right, which was nothing but R. The same thing we are going to see in case of cost of redeemable preference shares. Okay, Since they are redeemable preference shares, the same formula we will see what we saw in case of YTM. I told you all in bonds also that YTM is nothing but the rate of return, the required rate of return, which is nothing but R, which is nothing but KD. The same thing over here, cost of preference shares is nothing but R, that is required rate of return, which is nothing but KP, which is nothing but R in case of cost of preference shares. Okay, now the formula will remain same. Over there we had taken interest in case of bonds. Over here we are going to take the preference dividend plus redemption value minus the net proceeds divided by n. This is redemption value is nothing but at the end of life of that preference share what you are going to get that value minus the net proceeds, that is the net proceeds divided by n. The same formula, that is future value minus present value divided by n, the same it is, only thing is the terms have been given different name. Okay, the whole divided by redemption value plus net proceeds divided by 2. Okay, so the details of all the terms I have mentioned over here, so you all can read it. The formula is the same formula what we used for YTM. It is just now we are using preference dividend in case of interest for calculating the KP. Okay, so this is the cost of redeemable preference shares. Now cost of irredeemable preference shares, that is which are not going to be redeemed till the company liquidates. So basically you are not going to get the maturity value in case of cost of irredeemable preference shares, and that is the reason why we are just going to take the preference dividend and divide it with the net proceeds. Okay, so this is your cost of preference shares in case of irredeemable preference shares. I hope preference shares, the introduction of all the formulae, it is very clear. Just write down a summary of these formulas. Now we will solve some basic problems on preference shares, and I will upload a homework also for you all, so you all can solve this problem and upload it. Remember, they will be evaluated, so make sure that you all are uploading your homework. Yeah, that's all for today. Thank you.